Good afternoon and boa tarde. As director of the Brazil Center at Lilas, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Reflections on Semana de Arte Moderna on its Centennial. And what better way to commemorate this milestone in Brazilian cultural history than with a multidisciplinary presentation by scholars of art and literature. Today's event will be moderated by my Brazilianist colleague, Dr. Adele Nelson, Assistant Professor of Art History and the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American Visual Studies at UT Austin. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Adele.
Thank you so much, Seth, and welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here today. Paloma, could you enable me to share my screen? I just have a few images for the introduction. So we're so grateful to have Kenneth David Jackson with us and Regina Teixeira da Silva, desculpa, Regina Teixeira de Barros with us today. Let me just, to break up our online space, I brought in some images as I introduce both of them briefly. So today we're going to be reflecting on the Semana de Arte Moderna and its centennial with scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds. So Kenneth David Jackson, who we are delighted to be virtually welcoming back to UT, who was the member of the faculty here at University of Texas for a long time. And I hear through the rumor mill an honorary citizen of our state. So he is currently the professor of Portuguese at Yale University. His specializations are wide. He specializes in Portuguese and Brazilian literatures, and some of his many publications I'm showing on the screen now: modernist movements in literature and other arts, Portuguese literature and culture in Asia, poetry, music, and ethnography. And today we're going to be lucky listeners to David presenting to us from his new book from 2001, Cannibal Angels, Transatlantic Modernism of the Brazilian Avant-Garde. And in dialogue with David today is Regina Teixeira de Barros, an independent curator and art historian specializing in Brazilian modern art. Regina is currently a professor at the Centro Universitário Belas Artes in São Paulo, as well as an independent curator of many important shows. From 2013 to 15, she was the senior curator at the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo, and I'm highlighting just two of the very important publications she produced there. Since leaving the Pinacoteca, she's organized and co-organized several major exhibitions, including this show dedicated to Anita Malfatti at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo. And I wanted to conclude by highlighting one of her most recent projects, which she co-organized a show dedicated to revisiting the Semana de 22, and the questions that she and her co-curator Aracy Amaral posed in the title, I think will be interesting ones for us to return to in our conversation today. Modern where, modern when, and maybe a question we could add to these questions is modern for and by who. So with that kind of opening statement, I want to turn the microphone and the screen over to David. Thanks very much. Welcome. David, you're muted.
Oh, yes. There we go. Thank you so much. I want to thank especially Adele and Seth for this invitation. It's a real pleasure and honor to return, if virtually, to the University of Texas at Austin after a long time for the chance to take part in this in these reflections on the 100 years of the Semana de Arte Moderna, the Modern Art Week in São Paulo, and on modernity in Brazil. The year 1922 has been cast as a pivotal year in literature, a veritable dividing line in history because of the publication in February of James Joyce's novel Ulysses, and in the October issue of the Criterion of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. That February, the now celebrated Modern Art Week in São Paulo's Municipal Theater featured 3 evenings of exhibits, lectures, readings, and performances on February 13th, 15th, and 17th. The programs were dedicated almost exclusively to the music of Eitour Villalobos, punctuated by lectures and readings with exhibits of painting and sculpture in the entrance and hallways. Controversy intensified with the reading of new poetry by aspiring writers. And when in the theater lobby, Mário de Andrade delivered a spontaneous lecture on modern art to a shocked public armed with fruit. The success of Modern Art Week was at first a function of its scandal and negative reception by a city of less than 1 million inhabitants, populated since 1890 by large numbers of Italian immigrants speaking an Italo-Paulista dialect. The division of the city into bourgeoisie and working proletariat would later be documented in Patricia Galvão's 1933 novel, Industrial Park. The city's wealth that supported the week depended on coffee plantations and the financial backing of patrons Paulo Prado, other coffee barons, and Dona Olivia Guedes Penteado, two principal patrons of young artists and writers and sponsors of modernization, both in Brazil and later in Paris. At the time, the presentations at the Municipal Theater could only be considered modern in the context of a provincial city and the audacity of the participants. Yet, in the opinion later expressed by Patricia Galvão, the week marked a revolutionary moment, quote, the 10 days that shook the world of Brazilian literature, and a provincial reflex of the greatest revision in the arts to take place in the world and in history, end of quote, which is modernism. The contributions of the week to artistic modernization at the time did gain in importance by association with the centenary of political independence that year, commemorated in a national exposition from September to December in Rio de Janeiro, as well as improvements in urban planning and design in the capital. Two prominent Art Deco hotels designed by the French architect Joseph Gire were constructed for the exposition, the Hotel Gloria and the Copacabana Palace. And the Morro do Castelo, a hillside in the downtown district, was leveled and the earth used to prepare the Santos Dumont Airport. Portuguese aviators Gago Coutinho and Sacadura Cabral arrived in Rio in July after the first crossing by air of the South Atlantic. One can also look for precedents in the Third Pan American Conference of 1906 and the National Exhibition of 1908, both in Rio de Janeiro. In February of 22, however, pianist Guillermo Novice was the only participant who already embodied the goals of the week to be an accomplished artist representing Brazil with international recognition. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen to show Guillermo. Here we go. So, the goals of the week: to be an accomplished artist representing Brazil with international recognition. Guillermo had won first prize at the Paris Music Conservatory in 1911, toured Europe with Faré, and performed in Carnegie Hall in 1915, returning from New York to perform for the week. Although the official photograph associated with the week features 16 men with Oswaldo Andrade, they get my text, sitting on the floor in front, the success of the week depended largely on Guillermo, who played pieces by Debussy and O Ginete do Pierrozinho by Villalobos on the 15th. As its star performer, Guillermo embodied ideals of individual talent, professionalism. Oh, I have the wrong photo up. I want Guillermo Novice. There we go. Professionalism and international artistic acclaim. The week also depended on other women, pianist Lucília Villalobos, photo you saw before, let me get Lucília, a graduate of the National School of Music, performed all 3 evenings, including in a trio with violinist Paulina D'Ambrosio, who had won a competition at the Brussels Conservatory in 1905. Painter Anita Malfatti had studied painting in Germany in 1912, where she absorbed Expressionism before coming to the Independent School of Art in New York in 1915. Anita dominated the exhibit of plastic arts at the week with 20 of the 64 works displayed. The youngest participant, Zina Aita, had studied in Florence from 1914 to 18, and after the week would return there permanently. Patron Dona Olivia Guedes Penteado sponsored a modernist salon throughout the decade and accompanied the modernists to Paris in the 1920s. Modern Art Week was a moment, a symbol, an icon of the desire for modernization in the arts before the existence of a modernist movement or any organized modernism. The week promoted modern art, although not modernism, since there was no national movement or platform for anything more ambitious at the time. The week further embodied a paradox: how to defend national talent with its images of a young new country of the present moment, when Brazil's profound ties to the European avant-gardes were necessary conditions for its existence and recognition. A notable example of this conundrum was the name given in 1921 to a club in Paris by Jean Cocteau, Le Boeuf sur le Toit, a title taken from a carnival march of 1918, O Boi no Telhado, the ox on the roof, by Zé Boiadeiro, that composer Darius Milhaud had taken to Paris from Brazil, an example of the French pretending to be cannibals avant la lettre, devouring Brazilian folk music. Another challenge of the week is that most of the participants still had their major works in front of them. Performances featured almost exclusively compositions by Villalobos, yet before the output and fame he would achieve in Paris. Mário de Andrade read a few poems from his innovative work, Paulicea Desvairada, which would only be published later that year. In this context, the week was an uncertain promise of future production, and the recognition of its significance would develop only over time. In the years immediately following the week, an outpouring of major works produced by participants would help to confirm its promise of modernity. First exemplified by Mário de Andrade's extraordinarily inventive book on the city, the Paulicea Desvairada, or Hallucinated City, then poet Manuel Bandeira's Ritmo Dissoluto, Dissolute Rhythm, with its poem on the berimbau, Oswald de Andrade's Manifesto of Brazilwood Poetry and Pau Brasil Poems, published in Paris, Carlos Drummond de Andrade's mysterious poem, No Meio do Caminho, in the Middle of the Road, published in the 1928 Cannibal magazine, Oswald's own Cannibal Manifesto, and Mário's pan-folkloric novel, Macunaíma, alongside paintings by modernist artists, including G. Cavalcanti, Tarsilo Ramadan, Rego Monteiro, and Cícero Dias, and the more than 100 musical compositions by Villalobos composed during his years in Paris. The Semana would not have the meaning it has today were it not for the productions of those Brazilians in Paris in the remaining years of the decade. Tarsilo Ramadan, seen here in a self-portrait, Anita Malfatti, and G. Cavalcanti exhibited works, and Villalobos organized two massive concerts in 1924 and 1927. Oswald de Andrade lectured at the Sorbonne on l'effort intellectuel du Brésil contemporain, the modern effort of contemporary Brazil. And Ambassador Sousa Dantas organized dinners with personalities of the French avant-garde. Evaluated today from the perspective of 100 years, the week takes on symbolic and even mythical status because of the works associated with it, far beyond the programming that rocked the Municipal Theater for 3 days in February of 1922. Yet by mid-20th century, only Villalobos had achieved really an international career and fame as representative of Brazilian expression. But after 100 years, almost everything that followed the week is now seen as a consequence and a legacy. That connection is especially true of Tarsilo Ramadan, although she was not present at the week, in exhibits at the Art Institute of Chicago and the MoMA in 2018-19, where her celebrated painting, the Abapuru, connected with anthropophagia, or cannibalism, is now considered the most important work in Latin American art in the 20th century, with a value estimated in excess of 75 million. The future modernists from the week became leaders in the arts and letters of an urbanizing immigrant society in need of a valid identity for the new century. While they challenged the country's past and questioned its identity, they valued contact with the European avant-gardes, so to catch up with the artists who were the sign of the new. For this, most all of them had to separate themselves from land, family, and traditions, whether by extensive reading and research or by study and travel. In my new book called Cannibal Angels, I talk about these modernist artists, and I call them Cannibal Angels because they are Brazilian artists and intellectuals who created and lived the reality of a tropical primitive utopia at the service of national modernization in the early 20th century. They are artists who achieved a high degree of professionalization while representing Brazil with enduring works or performances. The cannibal reference is to Oswald de Andrade's Cannibal Manifesto of 1928, which through the idea of anthropophagia has become a frame of reference for cultural autonomy, post-colonial theory, and for the assimilation and hybridization of all that is external. Angels comes both from Baroque images, undoubtedly seen by the modernist group that visited colonial cities in Minas Gerais in 1924, to the painting of the same year by Tarsilo Ramadan, Anjos or Angels, with its expression of naive folk Catholicism. The term cannibal angels is meant to describe artists and intellectuals who were dedicated to the utopian goal of changing and improving society, whether by redefining nationality in a more comprehensive way, by incorporating folklore, popular sources, and everyday life in their art, or by a commitment to political and social justice and reform documented in their works and writings. Angels evokes the playful cherubic demeanor of sculpted figures spread throughout Baroque churches, especially those carved by Antonio Francisco Lisboa or Aleijadinho. The 20th century avant-garde angels are consumed by a desire for renewal, expressed with energy, inventiveness, humor, and often the sheer brilliance of the avant-garde play. I want to talk a minute about cannibalism or anthropophagia. It's an elastic and playful modernist metaphor of cultural cannibalism, elaborated in the wake of Oswald de Andrade's Cannibal Manifesto during the high phase of Brazil's historical avant-garde. I'm going to put up the first page of the Cannibal magazine in which the manifesto was published. It's now being discussed broadly as a metaphor of the century, capable of recentering the debate on arts and ideas in the post-colonial sphere. From the manifesto, only anthropophagia unites us. The Cannibal Manifesto appeared in São Paulo in 10 numbers from May 1928 to February 1929. The first dentition in the format of 33 by 24 centimeters and a scant 8 pages was followed by a second dentition consisting of 16 full pages in the newspaper Diário de São Paulo from March to August 1929. Published in an ephemeral magazine, the Cannibal Manifesto was soon forgotten in Brazil and only republished after 31 years. One of the reasons for the neglect was its very humor, wit, and ambiguity. Scholarship began actually only after the translations to Spanish in 78, to French in 84, and to English in 1993. A central reason that anthropophagia faded into the background and was forgotten for so long is that by the end of the 20s, the intense creative interplay with the French avant-garde, the presence of Brazilian artists in Paris, and their mutual fascination with primitivism had come to an abrupt end. The secondary reason is the lack of critical perspective that had to wait for Haroldo de Campos' 1981 essay on anthropophagic reason, Europe under the sign of devouring, which interestingly was published in Lisbon, to discover an autochthonous declaration of a new creative center by the, quote, new barbarians of the Americas, who were now considered to be more vital than Europe's. Anthropophagia could even be considered a revolutionary purgative, as explained in the 9th number of the second dentition, quote, the Carib tradition will save Brazil by fighting against false art, false morals, false religion. Everything will disappear, eaten by us with the greatest ferocity. It is the only system that will remain after all the ink in the world for writing has disappeared. Now I'd like to introduce you to a few of the major figures of the week, beginning with Mário de Andrade. In 1922, Mário de Andrade, musicologist, ethnographer, poet, essayist, and protean figure of São Paulo, published his most inventive book of poetry based on a stroll through his native city. His hallucinated city, or Paulícia Desvairada, a complex work that came out 6 months after the Modern Art Week, transforms the theme of the strolling poet observing his city into a self-consciously avant-garde composition, overflowing the boundaries of genre and the norms of discursive description. Beginning in the dedication, author Marijandraji emotionally dedicates his book to his master, Marijandraji. After an epigraph taken from a 16th century Portuguese author, the extremely interesting preface, as it's called, narrated as a confession and creed, follows as an essay on modern art that both creates and extinguishes the school of hallucinism. Although Mário never left Brazil, the hallucinated city reflects his wide reading and the international dimensions of his collection of books on literature, art, philosophy, music, and ethnography. When pianist Madalena Taliaferro performed in São Paulo in 1940, Marijandraji spoke to her of Paris as if he knew it well, although he had never visited Europe. And she says, quote, "He cited monuments and streets of Paris better than a Parisian, and he loved France like his own country," end of quote. As does the later Cannibal Manifesto, Mário's work also returns to origins. He describes São Paulo as a wild jungle where he sings alone like, quote, "a tupi strumming a lute." He writes Brazilian and seeks originality without wishing to make any disciples, and he promises to found yet another school in the next book. Towering over his own work, the poet weeps, sings, laughs, and bellows his energy, grand melody, and musical harmony. Mário composed his pan-folkloric novel, Macunaíma, steeped in legend and folklore with its own cannibal theme, in December of 1928. The novel is a virtuosic interplay between folkloric mythology and fantasy set in the Amazon. Macunaíma is based on a work of anthropological research in Roraima and the Orinoco by German ethnologist Theodor Kruck-Gunberg from 1911 to 13, with a collection of cosmic myths, heroic legends, and animal fables of the Talipand and Orecana peoples. The novel is also very well known through the 1969 film by Joaquim Pedro de Andrade. Next, I want to introduce Oswald de Andrade, the author of the Cannibal Manifesto. Author of 2 manifestos and 2 fragmentary inventive novels in the 1920s, Oswald is a motivating figure of modernism, quote, "searching for geniuses in the crowd while touring São Paulo in his green Cadillac." His Brazilwood poetry cleverly reinterprets the history of Brazil. In Paris in the 1920s, he and Tarsilo become, as called by Marijandraji, Tarsivald, leading up to the painting of the Abba Perdue and the famous Manifesto of 1928. They entertain the French avant-garde and themselves discover new interpretations of Brazil. Capable of great syntheses, Oswald lives in a constant mode of search and change, yet his varied literary production is enormous, seen in the 2 volumes just published in São Paulo by Jorge Schwartz of the now called Incomplete Works of Oswald de Andrade. And here I want to put up the first page of the Cannibal Manifesto as published on page 3 of the first number of the Cannibal magazine. Patricia Galvão, often called Pagu. In 1929, she was a young art student. Then age 19, she accompanied Tarsilo, Oswald, and a group of friends to Rio de Janeiro for Tarsilo's exhibit at the Palace Hotel, captured in a famous photograph of the group on board the ship that took them from Santos to Rio, which I'll show you in a moment. 3 of Pagu's drawings appeared that year in the second dentition of the Cannibal magazine, depicting the stylized outline of a suffering young woman in expressive, vaguely indigenous settings. At the exhibit, poet Raul Bompi dedicated a poem to her, the Coco de Pagu, that gives her the mistaken nickname by which she would henceforth be known. He thinks her name is Patricia Goulart, thus Pagu, while praising her seductive and entrancing beauty. The poem is published under a sketch of her in a hammock playing a guitar by G. Cavalcanti, which I have on the screen. By late 1929, Oswald abandons Tarsilo for Pagu. Their unofficial marriage on January 5th, 1930 marks a counter current, the beginning of a short-lived anarchic period of intense social critiques and of Pagou's unsuccessful yet passionate proletarianization, involvement with the Communist Party, and voyage around the world in 1934 and 35. Here's another image of Pagou. In the 8 numbers of a tabloid published in 1931 with Oswald called O Homem do Povo, the Man of the People, Pagou continues the critical program of the second dentition of the Cannibal magazine, which is aimed at the perceived defects of a patriarchal post-colonial society under the aegis of a cannibal program. Pagou writes the column, The Woman of the People, in which she unleashes scathing criticisms aimed at all sectors of society in a tone of condemnation. She follows up these columns with the proletarian novel published in 1933, Industrial Park Industrial, based on a dramatic portrayal of the Italian immigrant women workers in the textile industry of São Paulo district of Brás. The novel satirizes encounters of the bourgeois and upper class modernists to which Pagou has access as a former student of Tarsilo, and her incipient romance with Oswald. Her portrait of a modernist soiree in 1929 at Dona Olivia's mansion in the pavilion that she had constructed for meeting of the modernist group, featuring paintings from the European avant-garde, is a grotesque expressionist description of wealth, decadence, and excess. Her novel presents accusations against the Zwi Migdal, a corrupt organization of Polish Jews that brought Eastern European women to Brazil for prostitution by presenting them as French, which is echoed in Oswald's well-known play, O Rei da Vela, the Cannibal King of 37. In 1934 and 35, Patricia traveled around the world, going west, describing the experience in a late newspaper column as a round trip without any objectives. She arrived in Paris, where she stayed with soprano Elsie Houston and met surrealist poets. And actually now her time in Paris is the subject of a new book called Pagou no Metro, Pagou and the Metro, just published in São Paulo. She was deported to Brazil to save her from arrest, where she was then accused, tried, and imprisoned. After her release in 1940, she recounted her dramatic life story in a personal memoir written for her husband, Geraldo Ferraz, published in 2005 as Paixão Pagou. Now moving to Eitour Villalobos. The composer Eitour Villalobos astonishes French composers and audiences in his 1924 and 27 concerts with Brazilian instruments, rhythms, and themes. Villalobos is recognized as, quote, an unending source of rhythms and sounds torn from our jungles, from our birds, from our popular quatrains, from the depth of our nature and our people, quote. And those are the words of Cuban author Alejo Carpentier. Yet Carpentier is aware of his dilemmas as an American composer in Europe. Another quote, one must not forget that those who have taken up the arduous task of making American universal art are tilling virgin soil. Everything here is open for experimentation still to be known. One has to weigh the right amount of traditions, choose the richest folkloric elements, leave aside personal feelings to create the right technique. Our composer knows anguished and dilemmas that European composers don't have. The desire to find the universal in the details of the local, as Unamuno wished, keeps him on the tight wire at the border between the local and the universal. On one side, the rhythms of his native land, full of lyricism and a raw state that needs channeling. On the other are the eternal questions about the mode of expression and métier of pure music. End of that quote. His Choro No. 10, composed in 1925 for full orchestra and chorus with its clashing timbres, augmented instrumentation, and syncopation, contains the rhythm, dynamism, and full instrumentation of an Amazonian rite of spring. Its second section adds a full mixed chorus using a text and melody from the Parecis, indigenous peoples in Western Mato Grosso, collected by explorer Edgar Roquete Pinto in 1912. The single motif that is repeated throughout the work is taken from the song Moko Se Maka. It's continually repeated, Moko Se Maka, subjected to indefinite rhythmic repetition by the chorus. After the 1927 concert in Paris, Villalobos received invitations to conduct throughout Europe, and on November 27, 1928, his Danse Africaine, African dances, was performed by the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra under Leopold Stokowski, and in January 1930, the Shodos No. 10 in Carnegie Hall. After the massive concert of his compositions at the Salle Gaveau on December 5, 1927, Villalobos granted an interview to writer Lucie Madras in the form of a story of the composer's supposed captured by cannibals in the Amazon. This is how he told it. Sent on a mission to collect the folklore of the virgin forest, the young composer, she reports being told, was captured by savages, and while a captive, came to know their impressive music. While searching for his missing dog, without anyone to rescue him, and tied to a tree, his musical brain recorded their rhythms and chants while he waited to be eaten during 3 days that the tribe observed funereal ceremonies. Saved by Amazon women, he filled his compositions with those rhythms and modulations. Thanks to the composer's terrifying experience, this Amazonian music could now be heard in the Salle Gaveau. Such were some of the fantastic stories told by Villalobos. The symphonic poem and ballet based on the Amazonas, first composed in 1917, but only actually presented in Buenos Aires in 1935, is based actually on a Greek legend. However, it was the Amazonian theme, according to scholars, that opened the composer's imagination and led him to expand the percussion section of the orchestra, add instrumentation, particularly to carnival instruments that are not normally used in the symphonic orchestral tradition. So in conclusion, as an overview of the Semana, from the perspective of 2022, we look to evaluate the week and the legacy of 1922 through visual arts, music, and letters from the perspectives of the international dialogue it has received, its interplay with the European avant-gardes, as well as the criticisms found in anthropophagia and in the risk taken by the week in 1922 of an uncharted new vision for the future and the expression of Brazilian culture. And I end with this image of the modernist group going to Rio de Janeiro in 1929 for Tarsilo's exhibit with 3 of the major women contributors in the front row to the left, Pagu, then Anita Malfacci, and Tarsilo Ramadan, and immediately behind her with the hat, Oswald Andrade. Thank you very much for your attention.
David, thanks so much. Regina, may I pass the screen and the microphone to you?
So good evening. Before I start, I'd like to thank Seth for the invitation and also Paloma Diaz for the support to organize all the details of our meeting. And I'd also like to say that I feel very honored and very happy to participate in this discussion next to David and Adele, both of whom I admire so much. I also apologize for my English, which is not my mother language, and sometimes I make mistakes and make up words too. So if you feel I'm not clear, please let me know. So when thinking about women's production in Brazilian modernism, the names that come to mind are inevitably Anita Malfacci and Tarsilo Ramadan. But in addition to these 2 recognized women artists, indisputably central to the understanding of Brazilian modernism, others played an important role, albeit overshadowed by a male artistic system. And today I would like to address the works of the 2 female artists, Regina Gomes de Graça and Mina Klabin Wachowski. So I'll try to share my screen with you. Okay, can you see it? Okay. So this is a very difficult picture to find. If you Google Regina Gomes de Graça, you will have very few pictures of her. She was Regina Gomes, which was her name, before she married, was born in 1897 in land of the state of São Paulo. When she was 16, she moved with her family to Switzerland and enrolled with her brother and sister at the School of Fine Arts in Geneva. She studied decorative arts, a subject that had increasing prestige at the time. Because of World War I, the Swiss government, like other governments in Europe, was committed to renewing the cities and everyday life. So there was a big investment in technical schools that would ensure the training of young people to modernize the nation. And in this context, Regina became an expert in textiles and developed unique embroideries and prints for rugs, tapestry, cushions, bedspreads, and curtains. At the School of Fine Arts in Geneva, she met Swiss artist John Gras, who trained in architecture and decoration, and also painting and design. They married and settled in São Paulo in 1920. In the same year, they held a joint exhibition in the center of the city. His work was not well seen by the local critics, but hers called the attention of the ladies of the elite. Regina was then hired to teach them new sewing techniques. Why is this worth mentioning? The answer is that Regina John and her brother Antonio, also known as the Gomes de Graça family, are considered introducers of Art Deco in Brazil, and they are an important reference of the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk in Brazilian modern art and architecture. Regarding the couple, Regina and John, canonic art history says John was responsible for the projections of the interior for the projects of the interior designs as a whole, including furniture, railings, handrails, doorknobs, lamps, and stained glass. And Regina performed the feminine and secondary work of cutting and sewing, often materializing what had been conceived by her husband. So that's what canonic art history says. So the fact that Regina was hired in early 20s to teach the wealthy ladies in São Paulo new sewing techniques does mean a lot and changes perspectives. It means Regina was the one who first entered the homes of the São Paulo elite, not only contributing to the family budget, but also attracting customers for what would become a new niche in São Paulo's art world. Furthermore, it seems she was very sociable and friendly, while her husband, John, had a very reserved character and a lot of trouble with Portuguese language. He was therefore sometimes seen as a little aloof. Regina did all the sociable network, let's say. One does not know for sure if Regina participated or not in the exhibition at Teatro Municipal de São Paulo in February 1922. Let me show you a few images. So this is one of her compositions of the early 20s. 1925, approximately. A tapestry, also a tapestry in felt. As you can see, it's very Art Deco-like and still figurative with Brazilian, in this case, with Brazilian theme of the coconut tree. And this is what I wanted to show you now, which is the Teatro Municipal, a postcard of the 20s, and the distribution of the artists in the lobby of Teatro Municipal. So Her name is not included in the exhibition of the catalog, but in 1969, Young de Almeida Prado made a sketch of the distribution of the artists in the lobby of the theater on request of art historian Araci Amaral. Regina and John's name appear at the left of Anita Malfati's. As you can see, Anita occupies the main entrance to the theater, which is, of course, a privileged space, both in a physical and a symbolical sense. If Regina did or did not participate in the Semana de Arte Moderna is not the main point. The important point is that throughout at least the next 3 decades, Regina and John created and implemented many interior design projects, modernizing the homes of a demanding clientele attuned to the latest decor trends in Europe. In the late 70s, the couple, Carolina and Conrado Sogenist Filho, owners of the stained glass factory Sogenist, which was the only stained glass factory or the best known stained glass factory in São Paulo. They were owners of this factory and also friends of Regina and John. They gave an interview to art historian Stella Teixeira de Barros, who happens to be my mother. And Conrado revealed that John usually made several sketches for the same commission and then submitted them to his wife for approval. Regina had a great, always according to them, Regina had a great critical sense, and in Carolina's word, I quote, he didn't move a finger without consulting her before. They discussed, therefore, they discussed one another's production, establishing an effective dialogue as one might expect two artists with an equivalent training would do. And I'll show you some other tapestries from the 20s, the Indians here, as you can see, and also as Araci Amaral notes, abstract art most entered Brazilian modernism through the applied arts. So Regina is here an important name too. This is another rug. And another one, very abstract, both of them. And a cushion. Furthermore, Regina was a businesswoman, having founded in 1941 Indústria de Tapetes Regina Limitada, a carpet industry, employing as many as 30 artisans at a time to weave rugs designed by herself, by John, and by other artists. In fact, she had already shown her entrepreneurship in the early 20s when she studied the patterns of the Upper Amazon indigenous people, something that only she and Vicente do Rego Monteiro did at the time, possibly having in mind the potential of those patterns for the development of a modern and Brazilian language applied to fabric design, as we can see in the example in this rug and this other one that remind indigenous patterns of the Upper Amazon. One must also consider that Brazilian modernism is essentially figurative, as I mentioned, and the abstract art first showed up in the applied arts, as art critic Araci Amaral has noted. And as I mentioned, one cannot be sure if Regina Gomide took part in the Semana de Arte Moderna exhibition in 1922, but she did take part in other important group exhibitions, which became milestones in the legitimation of modern art in Brazil, among which the exhibition of a modernist house in São Paulo in 1930. exposição de uma casa modernista, Rua Itápolis. The modernist house, located in the heart of Pacaembu neighborhood, a newly opened neighborhood in the city of São Paulo, was designed and built by architect Gregory Warszawski. The idea was to rent it, says Warszawski, to a small family, preferably modest. But there were no other examples of rationalist architecture in town. At the time, there was only one other modern house in São Paulo, namely the one he, Warszawski, and his wife, Mina, lived in Vila Mariana. Warszawski decided to dress up the house, the Pacaembu house, with modern artifacts and open it to the public visitation so that they could know what a modern house looked like. He designed the furniture and the lamps and decorated it with works of modern art lent by his family, friends, and by the artists themselves. There were paintings by Anita Malfatti, Tarsilo Ramadan, and Lazar Segal, who, by the way, was Warszawski's brother-in-law, watercolors by Di Cavalcanti and Cícero Dias, engravings by Osvaldo Guilde, sculptures by Vitor Brecheret and Jacques Lipschitz, among other works. There were also pillows by Sônia Delaunay and cushions by Regina Gomes de Graça, as well as a rug made in the Bauhaus. One of the 3 bedrooms had a painting by Tarsila. This is the indoors, Casa Modernista, with a painting by Lazar Segal and the furniture designed by Warszawski. This is one of the rooms in the house with a painting by Tarsila and a bread spread designed by Regina. The exhibition attracted over 20,000 visitors in little less than a month. It was considered a huge success. In this context, it is worth calling attention to the silent contribution of Mina Klabin Warszawski, the architect's wife. Mina was in charge of the gardening of the house and the green decoration of its interior. But as with Regina Gomide, Mina's work was traditionally conducted by women and socially accepted as so. Possibly for this reason, her contribution still is scarcely ever mentioned by art historians. So I'll tell you a bit of Mina's biography, very, very short one, but so that you can have an idea who she was. Mina was the eldest daughter of Lithuanian immigrants Bertha Osband and Mauricio Freeman Klabin. She was born in São Paulo in 1896, 3 years before the foundation of Klabin Irmãos and Companhia, the first cell of what would become the largest paper industry in the country. Between 1908 and 1911, she and her 3 sisters studied at a Swiss school for high society girls, which guaranteed them a first-rate humanistic education. In the years that followed, the family often traveled to Europe, and in the first half of the 20s, Mina lived in Germany. Back in São Paulo in 1926, she met her future husband, architect Gregory Warszawski, in a party. Probably they were introduced by Lazar Segal, who had recently married Jenny Klabin, Mina's sister, the previous year, 1925. Mina and the architect were married in 1927, and the following year they moved to their house at Rua Santa Cruz, which I'll show you here. This is Mina. Also very difficult to find a picture of hers, but here she is. And this is their house at Rua Santa Cruz, considered the first modernist residence in the country. So there are 2 modern residences houses in São Paulo, the one in Rua Santa Cruz, which they lived, and the one of the exhibition at Rua Itápolis. This one I'm showing you now is their own home at Rua Santa Cruz. In addition to collaborating financially to build the house, Miná landscapes the huge garden with native Latin American flora, despised by the local elite, who prefer to see their gardens cultivated with European plants, which indicated their cultural reference and taste. Against this trend, Miná planted large trees native to the tropics, such as, let me show you. This is the house, also another view of the garden. And these are a few of the plants you can see there, still see there. So she against this trend for European gardens, Miná planted large trees native to the tropics, such as the gigantic guapuruvu, whose yellow flowers can be seen from afar, both in the countryside and in the coast, and papaya trees with its unmistakable fruits clustered on the top of the stem that could always be seen in the modest Brazilian backyards. In this unorthodox garden, the delicate designed leaves of the philodendrons and ferns coexisted with the more aggressive species such as the yuccas, dracenas, agaves, oponitas, and mandacarus. So years before Roberto Burle Marx, who is very well known for his tropical landscaping, Miná populated her gardens with tropical and semi-arid vegetation, thus participating in the artistic debate of her time, i.e. issues concerning national identity. As she had done in her own home, she designed other gardens. Including that of the modernist house, which is the one you see now, on Rua Itápolis in Pacaembu. Apart from the external area, Miná, which have the same similar species, Miná included a mandacaru cactus inside the house in one of the corners of the main room, which one has to admit was very much unusual in those days. Both the plant itself and the projection of its silhouette on the wall are quite frightening. Its spiny and erect shape and uneven arms resembling an ancestral creature. So there you are, other mandacarus, the one in Nabapuru, and one which is a real picture. So both Miná and Regina's production have been constantly underestimated by art historians until very, very recently. Their works are seldom seen in exhibitions nor reviewed by art historians and art critics, even more so when compared to their husband's production. So it's high time to include Regina Gomes de Graça and Miná Klabin-Warszawski in the debate about the search for Brazilian identity in the first half of the 20th century. And it's high time to study their role in the production, reception, and consolidation of modern art in São Paulo. Thank you.
Regina, thank you so much. Okay, so thanks so much for both of your excellent presentations. I know I learned a lot, and I know our audience on Facebook Live did as well. We have about 20 minutes remaining together, and what I propose is that we start with some dialogue between us three, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And Seth, please don't feel shy. You're welcome to enter as well. But maybe let me begin with a question about multi or interdisciplinarity. because I think that that's an overlap between both of your talks, and also, of course, one of the seminal components of the Semana de Arte Moderna is that it was interdisciplinary in the arts that it presented. So you can take this in whatever direction you'd like, but here are the kind of questions I'd like to pose to both of you around interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. And David, and this is a selfish question, it's a genuine one rather than a performative one, which is, I wonder what surprised you most as you worked on this recent book project, as you built out from your extensive knowledge about music and literature in Brazil and brought artists, visual artists, more to the fore in the dialogue that you are analyzing, which you describe in the book as a transatlantic exchange, right? So I would be very curious to know, you know, sort of, if you're willing, how that gelling worked. And maybe I'll go ahead and pass the mic to you, and then I'll pose a question to you, Hegina. Is that okay? Okay.
First of all, I want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be on the program, to share the program with Hegina, whom I'm also meeting for the first time. Cannibal Angels had been a project I had thought of doing for a long time, but when I finally got down to it, I saw that it was very different from what I had originally thought, because I had done a dissertation on Oswald Andrade many years ago, and he was to be the prime focus. But I suppose one of the most surprising things was getting into the theme of the transatlantic exchange. What interesting detail there was in the interchange between the European avant-garde and other figures, artistic figures who were in Brazil, and the Brazilians then who would study in Europe or then go to Europe for extended periods to develop their art about Brazil. Of course, it's perhaps not surprising since artistic education in Brazil had been based on really study in Europe for perhaps ever since the French artistic mission of 1816. But for a project like modernism that promoted a new image of Brazil, a new presentation of Brazilian expression, it is a bit paradoxical, the difficulties of meshing that with this very detailed European background. There's a wonderful anthology of Mendonça Tillis called Brazilian Modernism and the European Avant-Garde that juxtaposes manifestos to show how the Brazilians are trying to fit in. But I suppose certainly one of the things I learned was how many Brazilian artists had been in Europe since the first decade of the 20th century, right? And had really prepared the ground for the week, even though many of them didn't participate in it. So that we'd have to say that certainly the background for modernism and modernization certainly starts in the first decade of the 20th century. And I was, as a musician myself, excited to read that Pablo Casals had played in Brazil in 1903 and was responsible for sending the pianist Madalena Taliaferro to Paris in 1904, where she won first prize and became a great international soloist, and the same to a certain extent for Guillermo Novice, both of whom as young women attended his concert in São Paulo in 1903. Artists like Zina Aita, although she was the youngest participant in the week, had already studied for 4 years in Italy as an adolescent, a young girl, perhaps 12 to 16. So there are very interesting cases, right, of Brazilian artists who have had an earlier contact with Europe, as Tarsilo had twice, and who returned to Brazil to develop their talents. And there are other cases like Warszawczyk, who was mentioned, and some other artists as well, who had careers in Europe, who immigrate to Brazil right at this time, and then also integrate themselves with the Brazilian avant-garde as promoting also Brazilian values. So there's a real hybridity and mixture of the notion of Brazilian expression. And I was reminded of the Lazar Segal Museum in São Paulo. My close friend George Sweats was director for so long, where you can see this kind of integration of previous European painting and Brazilian content. So that was certainly one of the features of writing the book from which perhaps I learned the most, and it was one of the most surprising.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Regina, you can take this, you can also respond to things. I just saw you nodding vigorously as David was talking about those earlier exchanges. So, but I wondered, I mean, in the research you shared with us, right, you make very clear the gender stakes around our lack of attention to multiple disciplines, right, and the hierarchies that we maintain in the study of visual art. But David, I'm sure there are parallels in literature and music as well that are exclusionary categories, right? Hierarchical and exclusionary categories. So I wonder, like, building off of the research you shared with us and kind of what you were suggesting at the end there, I think with that final image, if you could, like, I think you've persuaded me that I need to be paying attention to textile design and garden design. But I wonder, and perhaps this is the wrong direction of the analysis, but how you think that textile and garden design and these two creators that you underscored, like how that dialogue fed back into painting and sculpture and kind of, yeah. So you can pick that up if you'd like.
Thank you, Adele. So I think that both gardening and textile design are very, let's say, easy ways to introduce a modern gaze in a house, which you don't need to buy big pictures or paintings, or they were not, of course, they were not expensive by then. But anyway, it's I think it's, let's say, Mina didn't do many works. She only worked with Warszawskyk. So her own, which means it was her own her own choices for her house. And I think it was well seen by this elite that was very trendy, going to Europe, coming and going to Europe. And also, and they were very, very attuned also with decoration. So abstract art or abstract design, better than, was something very new. And for Brazilians, which had never seen, they have never had any examples of abstract art. So I think they were very, let's say, very, very, they were not aggressive ways of showing modern art. They were, you know, like, they were kind of indirect ways, or very, because this is a problem also, because it is very difficult to find examples of Regina's works, because they were decorative works and textile works. So textile has very, it's very ephemeral. And also decoration is very ephemeral in itself. If you have a cushion on your sofa, you don't see it as art. Now we look back and we see how important those abstract designs in the sofas, over the sofas, were important, but there aren't many left, only some pictures and black and white pictures. So I think this is a problem. And Regina, there are some pictures left, especially of the gardens while they were very new. The plants hadn't grown very much. But Casa Modernista, her house, is a public place, and the garden is there, and it's amazing. It's beautiful. The house is falling apart, but the house is the garden is magnificent. So I think both they were sociably accepted as works. They were not they were not fighting with their husbands. They were not doing their husband's work, let's say, of conceiving, at least and also, sorry, Mina has another particularity, which is she had a saloon, just like Olivia Guedes Penteado, like Tarsila had one, but there's no story, no history at all about this saloon. This is a very enigmatic saloon for the moment, for the time being. I hope new research will soon be made on this. But maybe this is a hypothesis, because she was Jewish, as was Warshawski and as was Segal. And in the 30s, the Jewish group was left a bit aside because of integralism and the right. I mean, I think the crash, the New York crash, was very determinative to change the, let's say, the West socially, economically, in many ways, and also in Brazil. And this, I mean, Portinari took Lazar Segal's place in Mário de Andrade's heart, and the Jews were put aside. So maybe Mina wasn't studied, wasn't seen, her gardens weren't understood as a manifestation of modern art. Maybe also because of that.
Thanks so much. And oh, great. We have a question from the audience. And please, those of you who are tuning in from Facebook Live, please share questions. I'm going to ask one final question that builds off of what you both just said, and then we'll open it up, beginning with the question we have in the hopper and expanding out. I didn't know that about her having a salon, like a social salon for intellectual meetings, as well as Amaral and Penedo. So that's very interesting. Well, so both of you in your remarks today, and then Regina was just speaking about this, mentioned sort of white ethnicity, white ethnic identity, either immigrant identity, recent European immigrant identity, or as you were just talking about in one of the figures you study, her Jewish identity. And I wonder, I mean, what I'd like to speak about and hear your reflections on is like your analyses of the cultural appropriation that's happening amongst the artists you're studying, the artists, writers, musicians. You shared a great deal about Villalobos that I did not know, David, about what sources he's drawing upon. Yeah, and the textile designs that you shared, Regina. So I wonder if if you could talk about why these artists in the 20s are looking towards indigenous culture or Afro-Brazilian culture, and what you see as the sort of stakes of why they're doing it and how we analyze it today. David, I know that's a big question, but could I pass you the mic?
Of course. Let me say first that there's a kind of stereotypical opinion about modernism that divides it into the modernism of the 20s and then social themes of the 30s. Whereas actually there's a social concern throughout the 1920s and on several spheres. The short stories of Mário de Andrade, no one could find a more sympathetic view of the working class of São Paulo than in those short stories of Primeiro Andar. And also of Alcântara Machado, both of them who were portraying the Italian districts of São Paulo. And if you read, I think very few people have, the second dentition of the Cannibal magazine, on its 16 numbers, there are 6 essays on anthropophagia, mainly by Osvaldo Costa, which lay out actually a political and social agenda for the complete reorganization of Brazilian society and state by 1929. And I imagine we could look at artworks of some of G. Cavalcanti's portrayal of the Mangue in Rio de Janeiro, and perhaps there are others as well that will help us to show And it's a bit odd that no one has thought to put this together as a theme before, that actually concerns with social justice and portrayal of justice in society really began and was notable throughout the 20s. On the other, perhaps more difficult question of appropriation, certainly Oswald Andrade was interested in cannibalism and the figure of the indigenous, and in the indigenous figure, because he went back to Hans Staden and the story of the cannibalism right after the discovery of Brazil. All his sources were really printed books. Oswald had no contact or interest, as far as I can tell, in indigenous societies, people, languages, or anything. This was a pure avant-garde program, and of course, encouraged by the primitivist interests of the French avant-garde at the time, in which he was able to integrate, right, through the ingenious manifesto, right, a Brazilian take, and in a way, kind of a Brazilian originality of the cannibal idea, and of course reinforced by Tarsilo's paintings. However, in the Brazilwood Manifesto of 1924, he does promote Afro-Brazilian values and Afro-Brazilian culture. And although, of course, this is a small step, nonetheless, I think if we see it in historical perspective, in the same way that we see Gilberto Freire's really much more detailed study of the integration of Afro-Brazilian culture and the whole structure of Brazil in 1933, we have to give them credit, right, for not only recognizing, but promoting in their own way and giving more importance to the presence of Afro-Brazilian themes in the presentation of culture in Brazil. And particularly what's important is in the presentation of Brazil toward Europe, right? Because in the sense that the Semana was also presented by two important diplomats, right, and supported by patrons, it was really largely as well for the consumption of the French avant-garde, and to, as I said before, to show that there were Brazilian artists of international reputation who could be recognized and become part of an international artistic structure. And to a certain extent, they're including some Afro-Brazilian themes was an interesting part of that. Although, of course, it was an appropriation, and it was for secondary influences of the primitivism of the French avant-garde. So we have to recognize that as well. Even though they were distant from a lot of the sources, just as Villalobos was in his pretenses to have gone through the jungle and collected indigenous music, when actually it was Roquete Pinto, who was on the Rondon expedition, 1911, who brought back those gramophones and put them in the National Museum. And all Villalobos had to do was to cross town to the Museo Nacional and make a few musical notations. So sure, there was appropriation for many different reasons, but I think it was all for the, if we want to call it, the greater purpose, of course, of creating a quilt, as it were, a richer context for the presentation of Brazilian culture.
Thanks so much. Regina, would you like to comment?
Yes. I think when I was talking about the 20s and the difference between the 20s and the 30s, maybe I was thinking on Tarsila, about Tarsila do Amaral, who became an active 3 years or 3 paintings, interested in and her 20s, the production of her in her 20s is very naive in this sense. But yes, I think the main point, Lazar Segal, for instance, never always painted Bananal with a black face like a mask. Of course, this is, but what I see is very, very isolated poetics. I mean, modernism is not one before Oswald's Cannibalist Manifesto. It was like a sum of participants and not a program, I think. at least. But I also wanted to mention that there was in the 30s, there was this 20s and 30s, this idea of Brazilian people formed by the three races, indigenous, Afro-Americans, Afro-descendants, and Europeans. So, and I think that and I think that this is, and also thinking like Gilberto Freire, for example, uses a lot of this, and many others, Paulo Prado, they write about this to talk about Brazilian people, to try to define who are the Brazilians, and with the idea, of course, but with the idea of whitening the population. Does that term exist? Yeah, whitening. So the three races, and with a tendency to whiten the population as a whole. But I like that you mentioned, David, the Alcântara Machado. I'm very fond of his literature, and also João Bananeri, who is not so well known and writes a lot about the everyday Italian language. So that's it.
Thanks so much. So let me, we have a question from the audience that I'll read from Gino Costa. It is interesting that the modernist of 1922 tried to create an art that was national and original, but it was an elitist movement. Only rich kids could go to Europe and experience the modernism there and come back to Brazil to create this movement there. Isn't it incongruous that this art that wants to be Brazilian doesn't come from the people? That is, and its core continues to have a Baroque soul. Would you, either of y'all or both, like to respond to Gino Costa? Go ahead, David.
I'll say a couple of things. We have to remember that in 1917, Pixinguinha and Afro-Brazilian musicians were developing the choro and samba in Rio de Janeiro, and that in 1922, the Oito Batutas, right, that group went to Paris, played for 6 months in the Scheherazade Club, right? These were not rich kids, right? Also, we have to remember that Anita Malfatti wasn't wealthy, and a number of the others weren't either, but they benefited by scholarships. The São Paulo scholarship, called the Pensionato do Estado de São Paulo, was created in 1912 and sent an artist to Europe every year. And you could stay for 5 years and it could be renewed for another 5 years. So there were a number of artists who were financed by that scholarship, as well, of course, as the Afro-Brazilian musicians who were sent. And I assume that they had to, maybe they supported themselves by what they earned in the Scheherazade Club, I don't really know. But there was a, what shall I say, a much wider selection of modernist expression that went to Europe at the time, and that developed Brazilian themes. So while the week was certainly a week of European and inspired art, there were Brazilian art forms that went to Europe and that were incorporated. And in fact, you know, a lot of the themes, the Carnival Song of 1918, the Ox on the Roof by Zé Boiadeiro, Carnival Song, right, gets taken to Paris and becomes, right, name of a nightclub. So there's a lot of mixture, a lot of back and forth. So I think it would be, I mean, we have to see the kind of integration from different points of view, but there's a lot of Brazilian material that does come from the people, from folk sources, that finds its way into modernism, even if many of the artists who express it are not themselves, right, poor or from the popular sources.
I agree with David's ideas, and we have to think that, as David mentioned, the Teatro Municipal, the event in the Teatro Municipal was just one event, and the story about Semana de Arte Moderna is more important than the Semana de Arte Moderna in itself. And that's why we have the impression that the elite is everywhere. No, the elite, they rented the space and the theater, but in Rio, especially Rio de Janeiro, had lots of popular manifestations that were Lima Barreto's literature, that were coming little by little, or in the Northeast, the Literatura de Cordel, coming little by little into modern art.
Thank you both. So we have another question from the audience. This is Scott McLean, who asks, and Regina, I think we'll start with you on this one. What are Brazilians talking about in relationship to the celebration of the 100th anniversary? And David, of course, you'll have comments too, but Regina, it's a big question, but can you?
Yes, it's a big question. I'll try to be very synthetic. I think the main issues is the question of representativity. So the idea is that where were the Afro-Americans in 1922? Where was popular art in 1922? So I think these are the main issues that show up now. And I think it's interesting because they are contemporary issues, 2022 issues that we can't answer, or we can't ask the modernists to, we can't blame them for not having the same ideas we have now. What's important is to see how they proceeded, what they did, and not to do the same now. I mean, how to integrate society, how to integrate those that are more invisible, and the question of representation, I think, is central now. And but I don't like the idea of saying they didn't do like we would do, because they wouldn't do like we do, because they are 100 years behind us. So I think this is the main questions now that also always show up. Always people ask about these issues.
It's my turn.
Please.
So I agree with Regina very much. I think one of the things that's most interesting is that there's so much conversation, so many programs going on about the 100 years of modernism and the Semana. And one thing that we forget is that this was forgotten for at least 40 or 50 years. And, you know, in the end of his life, Oswaldo Andrade was no one. He was completely ignored and poor. So the first translation, even of the famous Cannibal Manifesto, even the one to Spanish, was not until the end of the 1970s. There was no one studying this until the concrete poets of São Paulo and Antonio Cândido started writing a few essays after the 50th anniversary of the Modern Art Week. So to come from that, where Tarsilo had practically no exhibits, even of Tarsilo, not to mention some of the other figures of the week, we have to sort of keep in mind that this was not the tidal wave event at the time that we think of now. And the fact that we're able to attach everything to the legacy of the week and to give it all this importance and the people and their characteristics and everything that relates to it, I think it's a very interesting development. We are certainly applying our questions of today to a moment that's not all that well understood and that was forgotten for so long. But I do think that if we go back and look at in more detail at the content of all that time around the week in the 20s, we'll find a lot of interesting detail. And in fact, there's a researcher, Genesis Andrade in São Paulo, is looking at photographs in magazines of the period and all sorts of other details to try to flesh out more information about what was going on. So I think first there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And the second is to keep in mind that this had no consequence, no follow-up, was just completely forgotten for probably half a century.
That's a good reminder. Our sense of history as being so monolithic and stable. That's in fact, so maybe a question to add would be why we center 22 now, right? What purposes it serves in our current debates. But we're kind of at the end of our time, but I wanted to, if you would like, we don't have any more questions from the audience, but David and Regina, do you have questions you'd like to pose to one another, or Seth or Paloma? No pressure, just I want to provide space if there is anything y'all would like to discuss further.
No, I'd just like to thank Regina for giving us these details about two figures that are relatively unknown, and I certainly learned a lot. It was fascinating to see how we need to work on more of the figures of the time. Thanks, Regina.
And I would like to thank David too for his broad view, which is very, very interesting, very multidisciplinary, and yeah, and it's full of information. I'm willing to buy your book.
I'll send it to you if I get your address.
Okay, but I absolutely need to read it and get in touch with all these information in detail. Thank you so much. And Adele, also, thank you so much for being there and guiding the conversation.
So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank David and Regina for these wonderful presentations. This was just a delightful event, and it was so eye-opening, so informative. I loved the discussion. I loved the presentations. I wanted to thank Adele for doing such a great job moderating this event. I thank you for all attending, and please stay tuned for other events that the Brazil Center will continue to sponsor over the course of the spring semester. So boa tarde, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you.